in 2004, the city council in the town of Monza in northern Italy, I should say that with an Italian accent, Monza, in northern Italy, that the town passed an ordinance that made it illegal to keep goldfish in a bowl with curved sides. One of the reasons they gave was that the curved sides of the fish bowl gave the goldfish a distorted picture of reality and therefore caused suffering. You're probably thinking this is a setup for a punchline, but I assure you this is a true story. There are lots of really, really good reasons for not keeping goldfish in a small bowl, and none of them have anything to do with just distorting reality. Those of you who have had goldfish, they're messy, right? You have to change the water every single day or they're going to get sick and die. And the other thing is that they grow fast. If you have a goldfish any longer than usually the few weeks that they seem to last for most people, if you keep them for even a year or more, you would be astounded at how quickly they grow. And they will soon outgrow that small bowl if you're taking good care of them. So what do you do then, right? But distorted reality sounds fishy to me. True story. I came across this story actually in a book called The Grand Design. It was written by Stephen Hawking, who you're probably all familiar with, and someone you may be less familiar with, but who's been co-authoring with him, a guy named Leonard Mlodinow. And what they were doing with this story was they were using it to illustrate a very interesting question. How do we know that our picture of reality outside the goldfish bowl is the one true, undistorted picture of reality? Goldfish may see things like this, right? A goldfish looking out the bowl, they're gonna see things like this. Everything would be curved, nothing would seem to move in a straight line. Then there's this next one, this famous example of the pencil in a glass of water where it looks like the pencil's in two pieces, but we know that it's not. This is something that students soon learn is called refraction, I believe. Now, Professor Hawking asks us to imagine that in that goldfish bowl is a little goldfish scientist. Okay, got it? Goldfish scientist swimming around in the bowl with curved sides, but this fish knows how to do math. This fish can do math and can discern the rules, the laws of physics that would enable it to describe and predict motion and also describe and predict the way that light behaves, just the same as we're able to do in our own frame of reference, okay? Well, Professors Hawking and Mlodinow, they tell us that if a goldfish could do that, first of all, the owner would be a millionaire, okay? I mean, that'd probably be worth something, but more importantly, we would have to acknowledge that the goldfish picture of reality is just as real and valid as our own, even though they appear to be so different. Reality isn't as simple and one-sided as we are led to think. And if goldfish could discover things like that, they might evolve, and maybe they discover other things like this. One goldfish says to the other in the bowl, it says, "Did you know that at one point in time it was thought that the fish bowl was flat?" Their worldview might change over time, just like it does for us. So the rules of physics, the mathematical rules governing the behavior of light that was all discovered by the goldfish scientists would be exactly the same as the rules that we discovered on our side of the fishbowl, and yet our experience of reality outside of the bowl, subject to those same rules, would be completely different. How can that be? How can that be? Well, imagine for a moment a human being who's capable of seeing things in the light spectrum that most human beings, that all human beings can't see, that's invisible to us. Imagine that for a moment. When it comes to things in the material world, do we ever see things exactly as they are? Do we ever see the total picture, or even the big picture. We may see up here a red tomato, right? We all agree that that's more or less a red tomato. Different shades of red for different people, but for the most part, I think we probably all agree you're seeing red. It's a tomato. But there isn't anything up there that's red. Think about that for a moment. That just happens to be the way that our eyes work. That's how our brain interprets sensory input. Human beings, we can only see light in the visible spectrum. Look at the light spectrum up here. I think that's on the next slide. Take a look at this. The entire electromagnetic spectrum goes from one side of the screen to the other. This tiny little sliver right here, that's the visible light spectrum for human beings. And within that, if we expand that out a little bit, red is just a portion over here at a certain frequency. And we all agree as human beings that anything that appears in this spectrum visible to our eyes, we're going to call it red. We agree on this. Our eyes, our brain are the things that determine how that works. Try to imagine somebody who could actually see down here in the invisible spectrum, like I said before, down in the realm of X-rays. I mean, I can imagine that someone could do that, but I have absolutely no idea. I can't even imagine what that would look like because it's so totally beyond my experience, beyond my frame of reference. Then there's a matter of perspective. And here's where it can get interesting. Check out this next image. Isn't that interesting? One shape can make two shadows. One shadow looks like a square. One shadow looks like a circle. Both at the same time. It all depends on your perspective. Which wall are you looking at? Which one is true? The square or the circle? Well, they both are, aren't they? And that's what you might call a paradox. Absolute and relative coexisting, two sides of the same coin, so to speak. Yet when we can step back and see the big picture, when we can step back far enough to see what it is that's causing that shadow, we realize, again, the big picture tells us both the square and the circle are true, and they're very real. Our perceptions, they're shaped by our location, our perspective. They're shaped by our history, our experience of our history, our genetic makeup, our gender, our physical construction, all going to create how we experience reality. They get overlaid on what we like to think of as reality. And so the challenge that we face in our human existence is to develop the capacity to step back and look for that big picture. And two of the biggest obstacles to stepping back and seeing the big picture are politics and religion. Can I get an amen? Amen. Politics and religion love absolutes, and they try to avoid the relative side of things. They try to avoid the big picture even. Political parties and different religions are absolutely certain that they have the absolute truth. One group sees only the circle, another sees only the square, and neither one is willing or able to even entertain the possibility that there might be a greater truth that ties it all together and maybe can explain the existence of both the square and the circle. Nobody wants to be the first person to step back because we've been taught that we might lose something if we do that. We might lose power. We might lose security. Fear enters the equation, and that can really get in the way of seeing the big picture. We're afraid of losing something if we shift our perspective or open our minds. Religion tells us that we're going to be punished if we dare to see things differently or to even think differently. Those who see the square are certain that those who see the circle, they're wrong. They're deluded. They're probably evil. and destined for eternal punishment because they don't see the same thing that I do. Now, there was a time on planet Earth when a certain Christian religious institution was the most powerful organization in the Western world. It told people how to think, what to wear, and how to live just about every aspect of life. Remember what we now call that time? The Dark Ages. When the human mind was finally unleashed, unshackled, unfettered, we called that the Age of Enlightenment. And religious institutions are still fighting it, and so are some political institutions. On Thursday, just this last Thursday, I saw some news about a recent study that was done by the University of Minnesota. The study showed that 40% of Americans disapproved of atheists, but they were in second place. Know which group got a 45% disapproval rating? Muslims. Muslims surpass atheists as most unpopular group in the U.S. Number 1 and number 2. So, it's bad enough. What this is telling us is that it's terribly bad. It's bad enough to be part of no religion, but it's even worse to be part of a religion that people don't understand. That's bizarre. Yeah. Only in America, right? I mean, that is just bizarre. In American culture today, one of the worst things you can be called is an atheist. I don't think it's so bad, but I've never been much of a representative of the mainstream. The majority of Americans wouldn't vote for a person unless they expressed a belief in God. So long as they don't call that God Allah, right? And yet when it comes to gods like, I don't know, we can name a whole bunch of them, right? Apollo, Poseidon, Zeus, Marduk. We're all atheists. I know what you're thinking. Oh, you're thinking, well, of course nobody believes in those ancient gods. Nobody believes in that stuff anymore, at least not around these parts, right? Because everybody in my group knows what we mean by God, right? And it's usually this guy. Am I right? There he is. Usually, that's the picture I like to use because, well, that's what a lot of people think of. By the way, this image comes to us from the tail end of the Dark Ages. For many people today, though, still, this is the subconscious image that gets triggered by the word God, the angry, bearded white guy. And even with that image in mind, let's just acknowledge, everybody may have the same image in mind, they still disagree. One group insists that God wants men to be circumcised and nobody's supposed to eat shellfish or pork. Others insist that this God wants everybody to receive sacraments from priests. Others insist that you got to be baptized by being dunked into a natural body of water. And still another group, actually two groups out there, say that God will punish anyone who dares to make an image of God, like that one, okay? Think about that. On and on it goes. Is it a square or is it a circle? Or is there something bigger that they're all missing? The title I'm using today, The Big Picture, also happens to be the title of a book that came out earlier this year by Sean Carroll. He's a theoretical physicist at Caltech. Now, if you're familiar with the book Cosmos by Carl Sagan, I know a few of you out there have probably read it or seen the series, think of this book as Cosmos on steroids. I started reading it when Karen and I were on sabbatical in May. I'm about halfway through it. It's just something you want to chew on and work with slowly. The book is based on this idea that Sean Carroll came up with that he calls poetic naturalism. It's his idea of the big picture, poetic naturalism. Poetic naturalism says that there are many ways of talking about the world. There's only one world. It operates according to one set of rules, but there are many ways of talking about it. It's kind of an important insight because it really begins to open things up. It's a pretty remarkable statement coming from a theoretical physicist because it means that he's stepping into the realm of meaning and values, which for so long was considered to be maybe off limits to people like physicists and biologists. But why? You look at this book and there are entire chapters devoted to quantum mechanics, entropy, and Bayesian probability, for those of you that get into those things. And there are chapters with titles like Constructing Goodness and Listening to the World. He offers an alternative to the 10 Commandments. I love this. He calls them the 10 Considerations. This is what he says about it. He says, it makes sense then to put aside the concept of commandments and instead propose 10 considerations, a list of things we think are true that might be useful to keep in mind as we shape and experience our own ways of valuing and caring about our lives. We can draw inspiration from the universe by listening to it carefully. So instead of fearfully clinging to our image of the square or the circle, Sean is inviting us to step back and look for that big picture, to listen carefully, not just to the universe, but to each other. Now here's another remarkable insight. This is from an article he wrote about the topic of poetic naturalism. The poet Muriel Rukeyser once wrote, "The universe is made of stories, not atoms." That is absolutely correct. There is more to the world than what happens. There are the ways we make sense of it by telling its story. The vocabulary we use is not handed to us from outside. It's ultimately a matter of our choice. That's really empowering. We choose the vocabulary. We get to choose the vocabulary. I'm thinking I might do a series on this book starting in January. That would be after the holidays and after our 7-week fall series, because for some reason January is when I like to explore these new leading edge ideas, and I think this one probably fits the bill, so we'll be doing a little bit more on this in January. But for today, for now, I just want to paraphrase a couple of the key ideas that he goes to at length in the book. He starts out by saying that the universe is an intimidating place, and it doesn't care about us. But we care about the universe. We develop understanding through the process of making mistakes. We make mistakes, and we turn that into a virtue by recognizing that we make mistakes, and then we work to do better at whatever it is we're attempting. The natural world tells us there's no such thing as perfection. There's just progress, and that's especially important when it comes to things like valuing, caring, loving, and being good. There's never a state of perfection where we can say, oh, we've done it, we've arrived. We're always in process when it comes to those things. And then he notes that becoming better people is hard work. Boy, isn't it ever. Becoming better people is hard work, but by sifting through our biases and being open to new ideas, our ability to be good advances. So, if we admit that we can always be mistaken, it makes sense to open our minds to our fellow human beings and hear what they have to say. Is it a square or is it a circle? What do you see, and what else might we want to look at together? This thing called consciousness, it does something very special. Consciousness gives us the ability to create an inner model of ourselves. That's a big part of it. The other side of that is that it also allows us to be able to model other people. That opens the door for empathy and ultimately love. Now remember, this is a scientist who's talking, and he caps it off with this. He says, to not only listen to others, but also to imagine ourselves as them, to consider what they care about, is a powerful driver of moral progress. Once we see that mattering comes from inside people, understanding others becomes more important than ever. No theologian ever said it better. Well, that's all for today on this topic. I do want to mention again that next week we're going to be doing something a little bit different, something I hope to be doing a little more often from time to time. There are a lot of really excellent movies out there that give us ideas and things we can learn about ourselves. So we're going to get together Friday evening at 7. We're going to watch the movie Inside Out. How many have seen Inside Out? It's that Pixar animated movie. You may think that these animated movies are for kids. No, this has a really powerful message for all of us. We're going to see the movie Friday night, but the sermon is going to be on Sunday about the movie. So come to the movie, come hear what the discussion might be about that. And even if you haven't seen the movie, we'll definitely manage to wring something out of it, even for those who haven't been able to see it. So we will see you then, and we'll see you soon right next door. Thank you.